Hi, and welcome to the OrgDev Podcast. So, we spend a lot of time in organizations talking about beginnings, new strategies, new structures, new priorities. What we talk about far less is about how things end. Endings tend to be rushed past in the push towards whatever comes next. Projects stop, teams change, funding ends, roles disappear, and we quickly move on without really pausing to acknowledge what's being left behind. In this OrgDev episode, we're focusing on endings as a critical but often overlooked moment in leadership and organisational life. What happens when endings aren't handled well? And what does it really ask of leaders to lead through them with care rather than avoidance? We're absolutely delighted to be joined by Lizzie Bentley Bowers and Alison Lucas today. Both are executive coaches and facilitators working at board level across all organisations. Alison is director for the Randolph Partnership and Lizzie is the founder of Causeway Coaching. And we found them through their book, the brilliant book, Goodbye, Leading Change Better by Attaining to Endings. And it's a must read. In fact, Danny approached me just before Christmas and said, I've read a book. We absolutely have to have Alison and Lizzie on it. And as soon as we discussed the topic, we suddenly realised this is something that's been missing from the OrgDev podcast from the very beginning. So we're so happy that Alison and Lizzie have given their time today to talk about their work, their thoughts, and their book as well.
So yeah, if you're on audio, then I've got my usual book with all the tabs. So I've devoured this. I think it made me. I really enjoyed it from a. There's lots to talk about today. I really enjoyed it from a kind of organisational perspective, but I think also personally, just making me think about transitions going on now and endings and things I've been involved in the past. So it was a really good reflection piece for me as well. Just to kick us off, tell us a bit about the book. What inspired you to write it?
The main thing I think was we realised that this was something that we were encountering all the time and that people could do it better. It's as simple as that. It could be done better. And we have always been great believers in thinking about how, not just what do organisations need to do, what do leaders need to do, but working with ourselves and with our clients on the how. Because the what is all very well, but without a how, it's not as much use. So we felt this could be done better. We wanted more people to be talking about it. And we didn't want to be talking about that without saying, how do you do it? So that's what initially inspired us to write the book. It's a gap too, Ali, isn't it?
Yeah, I think when we've been talking about it for a long time, and then when we always talk about turning to our bookshelves, and there is nothing in executive education and leadership about endings, and we sort of came up with these four. I love a Venn diagram. We came up with this Venn diagram of four overlapping circles, not quite the Olympic rings, but four circles, and in one was sort of loss and grief work, in one was change management, in one was leadership, and in one was emotional intelligence, emotional agility. And we realised that what we were talking about was bringing all of that together into the middle of that Venn diagram. And when we took our proposal to our publisher, and part of writing a proposal is you have to say, what are you competing with? What else is in that space? There was absolutely nothing in the middle of that Venn diagram apart from goodbye. And that is incredibly exciting. And it's also part of what's really interesting about wanting to start a conversation about it, which is why it's so exciting to hear that you loved it and you're picking up and wanting to talk more about it, because sometimes it's much easier to have something in a space where you go, well, it's like this, but we've done these improvements. Whereas what we've been saying is our ambition is to start the conversation about how we could do endings in organisations better. That was our ambition. And I think we've achieved that, which is feeling amazing, isn't it, Lizzie?
It is. It is. And there's something you said, Garen, at the beginning about brighter beginnings. And that's the reason why, is we really believe, and our experience shows us, that when you pay more attention to endings, it is the brighter beginnings piece that is the benefit. I'm sure we'll get into this, but in so many ways. And we thought we'd covered them. We thought we covered them all. Maybe no, we didn't think we'd cover them all. We certainly felt like we'd covered a lot as we were writing the book. And what's been so exciting is that the more we have conversations with people, the more we realise just how we talk about ripples and how those ripples of paying attention to endings have such an impact in so many ways on beginnings all the time.
And then for people who've not had the chance to read the book yet, and I would encourage lots of people to read it, when we talk about endings in organisational life, what sort of things are you kind of really pointing to, and what aren't we talking about?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Danny, because what we're talking about is endings within an organisational framework. So first, what we're not talking about is we were really clear back to those sort of overlapping areas that we are not loss and grief counsellors. You know, that is something that would need a specific intervention. So we're talking about everyday endings, Garen talked about a lot of them at the beginning. A project that gets cancelled, a team that gets disbanded. So it can be organisational endings, a whole office moving, or it can be an individual endings, one person retiring, one person being made redundant. It can be an internal promotion, which often people don't think of as an ending because they're still here and they're translating into a new leadership role. But absolutely, an internal promotion is an ending. And early on in the book, we've got an exercise about asking you to name all the endings that are going on around you. And when you start doing that, you realise quite how many there are. And they don't all need to be walked through a process and they don't all need to be attended to, but just raising that awareness of the endings that are going on are really important. And then the caveat is that it's within the realms of leadership.
Yeah, so some of the first things we say in the book, well, I think it's the first line of the book, Ali, isn't it? That we say there's a myriad of endings in organisations every day. There are so many, and there are some that are even perhaps not given their full attention as endings because they're seen as temporary. So we're thinking about things like taking sabbaticals or temporary secondment, parental leave. So those are just other examples of the sheer volume of endings every day. We have to be really careful to say that, and particularly as we wrote this book during COVID, or started, we started to write this book during COVID. We certainly started to recognise even more need during COVID. And we wanted to offer leaders some practical ways to find a way through the fact that the number of endings was increasing. You know, organisations were closing, merging, new ways of working were having to be found at speed. The ways we used to even do the endings we did pay attention to was changing at speed. But what we wanted to be really clear on is that at that time, of course, people were facing the ultimate ending. There was an enormous amount going on in organisations around loss and death and grief. And we knew we wanted to take real care to say, this is not what we're offering. And I think it's really important to always acknowledge that there's some incredible work that goes on in that space for organisations, for leaders, and we point to some of that in the book. And we really encourage people to get that kind of support. But yeah, it's not a book about some of those ultimate endings that people face.
When you think about some of those endings we've talked about, so projects finishing, promotions, people moving on, why do endings matter more than many leaders kind of realise? You started to articulate, I think, that, but can you just expand on that? Why do endings really matter?
Ali's got this lovely phrase, the full colour tale. And one of the things we've noticed is that if you ask somebody if they've ever had an ending in an organisation, an organisational ending of some kind that impacted them, or they've left an organisation in a way that impacted them, brace yourself, because out will come what Ali calls the full colour tale of what happened, when it happened, how it happened, and how it still impacts them now, often years later. And that can impact the way they then make decisions in their new roles. It can impact their confidence. It can impact their level of trust, their level of engagement. It impacts their families. It impacts the people who were witness to that ending, whether they've stayed in the organisation, whether they've left. It ripples out both internally and externally and reputationally. There is so much that is impacted by the ending, but also by the beginning that follows.
Really good and subtle example of that is, say a leader gets suddenly exited and goes on the spot under some sort of compromise agreement. Everybody that's remaining in the organisation makes their own sense of it, doesn't really know what's happened. Nobody contacts that leader through not really knowing if it's okay to or not. So none of the ritual, none of the acknowledgement goes on. For that team that stays, that needs to regroup, to take up the slack while something else happens, it impacts their sense of self, belonging. Where does decision making sit? Is this how we do business around here? A sense of safety. It can impact on many different ways. As Lizzie said, then the family of that person that's been let go and how they're feeling about everything. We often think it's just about the person that has gone. That's the obvious one. But then the person that comes in 6 months later and occupies that seat and doesn't quite know why it feels the way it does, why it doesn't quite flow, why they haven't quite got the trust of the team. And that's the sort of invisible threads that often are behind it. And that's why we've started talking about it's language we've developed over the last 6 months, actually, with all the writing that we've been doing, that this is about being stewards of those endings for the whole system. Beyond, I need to take care of so and so because they are being exited from the business. It's actually being a steward of understanding all of those ripples in service of those who remain, those who stay, and those that come next.
And it's so interesting. One of the things as we were writing the book, but particularly as we've been talking about the book, is that understandably, organisations and leaders want to think about why they would invest in paying attention to this. So, what's the financial impact? There's a reality to that being important to organisations. Of course there is. And so that's been really interesting to us because there are so many benefits to paying attention to endings that are perhaps harder to measure. They're measured in things like well-being, they're measured in the quality of decisions and how do we know that and all of those kinds of things. But there are some things that we really can look at in terms of when you look at what is the investment that you made in the beginnings, what is the investment that you made in onboarding processes, what is the investment you make in recruiting into roles where, to Ali's point, something isn't quite working and we can't articulate why. What's the investment that's made in well-being support when a team is struggling to trust each other, or when a pitch isn't won because the team hasn't gelled, because they haven't truly moved on from what it is they were doing together before, or the way that they came together. There's just these endless ramifications and ripples that I think it is possible to put a price on. And particularly to put a price on, again, what is it worth to us if those things are better? And the chances are that's a lot. Mergers and acquisitions is another place that we see. We talk about that as the most complex ending that organisations can encounter often. The things like you might be saying goodbye to an entire brand identity as it merges with another one, to history, to legacy, to the founding of one organisation that is being acquired by or merged with another, and endless examples of how if you paid more attention to what closes and what the beginning therefore looks like, look at that 5 years down the line and you'll see that you made a huge difference to outcomes.
Yeah, because I think as you were talking there, I was thinking about all the myriad of applications here, and I'm sure people watching thinking, oh yeah, that explains so much. And I guess in action, one of the things you talked about is loss and grief. And I guess I'm sort of curious about what does that look like? So for example, there's a constant need in organizations to keep moving forward. And yet when there is loss, mourning comes with it as well, doesn't it? And if people don't necessarily give the time or the space or the patience for these things. So if you're a manager, for example, who has had to do redundancy and needs to make space for their team, but can't necessarily talk about it in detail, like what are the things that they have at their disposal to sort of help them through that process?
So I think you've named the two most important, which is time and space, and that assumption of rushing on. And sometimes it is an assumption because we get into the habit of speed, but sometimes it's rushing on because we don't want to sit with those froggy emotions that go with loss and grief and the fact that this is different now and we are going to miss some of these people and we need to regroup. So I think there's a convenience in rushing forward. So time and space and finding the right place. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the manager that helps people to process this stuff, but actually saying it's okay, acknowledging the fact that it will feel different, that it's going to take some time, not piling on objectives straight away, checking in with people. And I did a piece of work with two teams that came together who were part of a bigger merger, but this is two specific teams coming together. And in an hour, they did a little bit of history telling of where they came from and what the separate identities meant to them and what the reality of this merger meant for them. We basically walked through the steps and how they were feeling. And they had really mixed feelings from, I've worked for company A for 25 years and it runs through me like a stick of rock, to I was recruited into this company 6 months ago and you were already merging. Hey ho, I knew that this was going to be great for me. And just that little bit of history telling and naming of emotions, and we gave them emotions cards so they didn't have sort of, they could just say, yes, I think I've got these ones going on. brought the collective together to then start in the afternoon. They were doing strategic planning going forward. So that is time and space, but that's not, a never-ending indulgent time and space. That's a specific structured time and space with a bit of thought put around it and process that allows people to think through, actually, what does this mean we come together? And then the acceleration of them coming together because they had done a little bit of grieving and sharing. And then encouraging them, if there's more to talk about, that they need to find a place to take that. So I think it's keeping the manager's role in proportion, but being really cognizant of the fact that this might be needed, whether or not it's that you're leading it and managing it or giving time and space for it.
I guess one of the things that's probably really important to communicate to organisations is that this is not indulgent. It has a huge impact on the operational bottom line, isn't it? I'm sort of reminded of a situation that I was called into, and there was just a senior manager, and he was seen as being very difficult with slowing down performance, the way the team's in. And only when you went back through his story that he was actually carrying the trauma of people that he'd worked with 20 years ago that had just been walked off site after serving the organisation for multiple decades. And he was still hanging on to that. And that had such a big impact. But it's that kind of sort of thing that we don't make time for it, do we? And we kind of move on. But those, you talk about leaving scars in an organisation. There's a lot of scar tissue that exists in organisations.
The image that comes to mind as you described that, Garen, which sounds incredibly difficult for that individual, is that kind of put a lid on it, keep it down. Because, and I think there are a number of reasons that, speed is one of the reasons why people do this. But I think there's also there's a really understandable nervousness for a lot of leaders, for a lot of managers, for a lot of people who we're asking to do more, to hold that space about how do I do it? What do I do if the emotion becomes too much? And therefore we try and simplify it. We try and put the lid on it. We try and simplify it. We often talk about the fact that if you can name, Ali's talked about naming emotions, and it's so important because you might be feeling sadness, but you might also be feeling some relief. You might be feeling some guilt about who's staying and who's going. We're not feeling one thing at a time throughout the whole process, and we're different people are feeling different things at different times at different levels. It's this whole mixing desk of all these different emotions we might feel, the levels at which we might feel them, the time at which we might feel them. And we're not saying that, as leaders and managers, of course you haven't got time to do nothing but facilitate those emotions. But if you go the other way and you do none of it, that's still going somewhere. That emotion is still going somewhere. It will show up. It will show up in other roles. It will show up in decision making. It will show up in confidence. It will show up in trust. It will show up as the description you've just given 20 years later. And giving it some space, that if it turns out it needs more, as Ali said, then you work out, okay, well, where else could you take this? But actually, in the vast majority of cases that we encounter in the work that we do, it's enough. It's enough space. To give it some space is enough space. To name the emotions at all is enough.
And it's interesting because a lot of managers are sort of pre-programmed to want to solve things.
Yeah.
Is there something just about letting it be? Like, I may be feeling sad, but don't fix it. It's just leave it with.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely spot on. I think the fix it, rescue, how can we move this forward? And often it is let it be. It's sitting with those feelings and knowing that these too will pass, and people can process that on their own, that it's not just because somebody says they're sad that you have to fix that. It's one of the reasons why I got emotional agility back out this morning, because she talks about in sort of being in contact with our emotions, then it's not about being run by our emotions. And she had this lovely phrase about by being in contact, then we can put distance between the thinker and the thoughts, the feeler and the feelings. I need to see some tabs like you. I'm just got pencil marks everywhere, Danny. But I think it is exactly that. It's just because somebody's expressed an emotion to you doesn't mean you then have to solve it. You just have to acknowledge it. And if it doesn't go away and doesn't move, then that person might need to take it somewhere else. But I think your story about the chap and all those exits 20 years ago, I mean, history matters. And again, what can managers do? Taking a little bit of time to understand the history of how we got to here, and why somebody might be feeling or behaving in a way. I can't tell you how many times I've had a one-to-one client say, I'm finding X really difficult to manage. And then I say, tell me about the history. And so many times though, it might be something like, well, they were on temporary promotion for my job. And then I came in and they've done nothing to talk about the ending of the fact that that person was acting up and then didn't get the substantive promotion. And yeah, I've probably heard a version of that 100 times. And that's not much to sort of understand before you start judging behaviour, which was what I'm hearing was going on with your chat, to actually think about what might have led us to here and to be curious about how did we get to here, because there's probably some absolute gold dust in there.
I was going to say, I wonder if some of it goes to the very heart of how we portray change in our organisations and kind of the role of a leader to be positive. And if we've got a big change or transformation, then that drive to just be positive about it and not acknowledge the downsides. We're not very good, I don't think, in organisations at saying, yes, we're doing this thing, it means a huge amount of change. There are positives, but we also need to acknowledge the downside. So we're not very good, I don't think, in organisations at doing that. So some of this goes to the heart of that, I think.
Sorry, I was just saying,
What was that?
I was saying, wouldn't that be grown up to do that? I mean, that's genius.
Well, and it's really interesting because in the book we offer 4 steps: and reality, emotions, accomplishments, and ritual. And to your point about positives and negatives, we start with that reality step. Name the full reality, because what people tend to do is put the reality into these positive and negative buckets. And what we're challenging leaders to do and inviting them to do is say, what's the reality? Before we get into the emotion and how I feel about that reality and how other people feel about that reality, let's name it and let's try not to categorize it. Because if by doing that, so for example, what we've experienced is that in naming the reality, people are able to then say, oh, and actually there's this aspect that I hadn't considered, because they haven't got caught up in the emotion of the first thing they were talking about before they've named all these different strands of the reality. And maybe even thinking about, what's the dissonance, the timing dissonance in that reality? Because often some leaders are aware of and working on an organisational ending that then they sort of lose sight of the level of surprise that is for people who've just heard that news. And again, separating out that reality can really help us to, before we get to the emotions, pay some attention without the judgment.
I'm going to ask you a horrible generalizing question here. Do you think that sometimes managers underestimate people's ability to take on this reality, and maybe they want to sort of protect them for it, or take on the role of parent for their people?
Yeah, in transactional analysis terms, you might call that marshmallowing, that sort of nurturing parent going a bit too far. And actually, part of reality is clarity. And I think whenever you have clarity, however much you might not want to hear what it is, it gives you choice. And I think managers often in that way just marshmallow and fudge stuff. And actually, when we can be clear and we can talk, as Danny beautifully said, the change is a reality. We need it. There are going to be positives. This is where we're hoping it's going to take us. But this is what we're going to lose in the meantime. And this is what we need to work through. That level of clarity and honesty, I think as human beings, most of us can cope with that. But again, it's back to what assumptions do we make that leaders and managers ought and should be doing.
There's something really interesting about measures of success there. How are you measuring the success of a transition? How are you measuring the success of a change? And as you asked that, Karen, I'm reminded of work that we often do around delegation. And I'm sure you've encountered this many times, that people get to a certain position and they struggle then with the delegation because they don't want to overburden people, or it all becomes about what they don't want to do rather than giving those people the credit for wanting to do those things, or for having a conversation about those things, or being ready to do those things, having those opportunities. There's something about sometimes when we go into these leadership and management roles, we overstep our responsibility for how other people feel, rather than being the space in which they can express it. We could discuss it, work it through. It's okay if we're a bit uncomfortable, because that's the point. We'll get to a place of comfort. And so many of these principles that we've applied to endings, leaders are really skilled in this. Or if they're not, they become skilled when they notice it. And it's that there's something about how can you translate those skills across and pay attention to this often ignored subject.
So in a lot of organizations, it's clogged up with zombie projects or zombie initiatives. They were launched with great fanfare, town hall, whatever. Cakes were brought in. This is the next big thing that's going to save us. And people really put their effort behind it. And then they just kind of, Danny sort of says, projects die a day at a time, which is very true, isn't it? And they just kind of fizz out. And you talk about the importance of rituals, but there's very rarely rituals about a project or an initiative ending. And so they kind of carry on. I guess, what's your perspective on that? Is that something that you see in the organizations you work with? And what can organizations do to sort of clean house? Because it's kind of entropy in a way, isn't it? Like, it creates disorder in an organization when there's so much stuff out there that just hasn't been ended and it's just in the ether.
Gosh, there's so much in that. I love that projects die a day at a time. It's so true, isn't it? And well, gosh, my head's going to so many places, but the opportunity there to name that reality, and it's courageous work, but to name that reality of the fact that this is no longer working, or this thing we had great intention for and high hopes for, let's be honest about where it is. And let's be honest about it so that the attention, the energy, the time, the money that is still going into keeping that alive as it dies gradually could be spent on what's next, could be spent on rounding it off in a way that enables everybody to move on to something that is going to work. There was something also that was pointed out to us as we were writing the book, and we were interviewing some people as we were writing the book, that really stayed with me about inclusion and endings, and how if we're not paying proper attention to the ways of working that need to end, and we're naming them as they end, the danger is we actually carry through some of the thoughts and behaviours rather than truly shifting them. So the amount of opportunity that comes with paying proper attention to courageously naming, this doesn't work, or this doesn't serve people well, this doesn't serve the organisation well. Again, we keep using that word myriad. There are so many ways in which working life could be improved by having the courage to say, either this needs to end or it is ending. Let's look at it. Let's open our eyes and take a long, hard look at it.
I love the fact you said clean, because I think so many things do drift on. In fact, they have ended a couple of years ago, but nobody's formally taken them off the, project sheet, payroll, whatever it is. I think there's something really interesting about how those are sometimes attached to ego. Sometimes attached to the beginning and what we've invested. That sort of what's that phrase about sunk cost fallacy, that actually, because we've invested so much in this, we need to continue, and it's just got this sort of nosedive tail. And I think the advantage of, if we can encourage organisations to actually really look and think how much time and energy going into things that actually are not materially contributing anymore, you have the opportunity to do something clean. And then the step that we recommend is back to the accomplishments, is that then gives you the opportunity to do lessons learned. It's not a sort of skulking away, my project was canned. It's the given probably 100 context shifts, because that's the world we work in, have happened since that was launched in good faith. Actually, what are the lessons learned? What can we do to be more agile, or what worked well on that project, even though we didn't get the outcome? And again, if we're too attached to it, we can't do that work. And by ending it cleanly and thinking about it, rather than just walking away from it, actually allows you to work out what can we take from that, which might be, gosh, once we do this work, we've got all these zombie projects. But I think it's really interesting, because we put projects into the book, and it felt like a really subtle one. And actually, I think you could just talk about projects the whole time, because probably people never think actually ending a project is something, but there will be emotional attachment to it. There will be people who have staked something big on it, people who believed it more than others. It's really interesting that projects often get cancelled when new leaders come in, and that might be about ego and direction of the new leader, but it also might be about clarity. If it's easier for me to look at that and go, no, that isn't working.
I was going to say, as we're talking, I'm just thinking Professor Julie Hodges at Durham has written some books on leading change, and she talks about the ghosts of changes past and, the impact that has on people being ready for more change. So if you haven't addressed the project that kind of just quietly drifted away, that somebody really committed to and bought into and put all their efforts into, and then you're bringing out a new big thing, and you're sat there going, well, why aren't they excited about this time? It's because I think, it's tied in with this. You've not attended to the endings.
Yeah, and those ghosts can be the ghosts of success as well. So the same is absolutely true for successful projects and for change that's happening as a result of success. There's still a reality to what's ending. There are still complex and different things that people are feeling. Not everybody is going to feel 100% great about everything, even if it looks shiny and great on the front. And often the accomplishment that gets noted when a project is successful is the final outcome. But there were all sorts of outcomes along the way that are worthy of learning, of acknowledgement, and how, again, might a ritual ensure that when we go to the next project, we are starting it anew and not running the risk of saying, oh, well, it worked over there, so it's going to work over here. Because that's a hope.
One question I just want to ask that's just been sort of bubbling under for me in this, and you may or may not have an opinion. You talked about emotions, and if we're talking about things like bringing a project to an end that was launched with a lot of political capital and social capital attached to it, or someone's been moved on that was seen as the next big thing, is some of the uncomfortable emotions that come with that, which is like shame. Which is, I may have been partly accountable for this, or does shame play a part in this? Why endings aren't tended to? Does it something that you see in your work quite a lot?
I think it does hugely, and I think it's the reason why we say you have to start with yourself. Every time we've ever been on a course, and as practitioners, when you go on a course, you think you're going to learn about how to do useful things to other people, and then you sit there and go, "Oh, I've got to learn about what this means for me."
Damn it!
And that's exactly the same with endings. That you have to understand, your own relationship to endings at that sort of meta level, but then at an individual ending, you need to work out how you're feeling about it. So let's take the example of I'm a leader and I'm using a restructure to make somebody redundant, but secretly I'm relieved and feeling a little bit shameful and guilty because I have avoided putting them on performance improvement plan. So the restructure has allowed me a clean way of doing it where I can pretend it's got nothing to do with me not facing into difficult conversations. You have to start with self to actually be able to work that out, to then be able to be supporting that person, or knowing that somebody else should probably support the person because you have avoided performance managing them. So I think shame, guilt, embarrassment, which is a sort of slightly different hue from shame, are really part of that. And part of that, let's rush on and forward and it'll be better next time.
There's a chapter in the book we call Giants, because rather than having a bibliography, we wanted to acknowledge the giants on whose shoulders we sit as we write the book, and the different people's work we bring together. And Brené Brown is one of them, and her work on shame and vulnerability. And she talks about how shame thrives in dark, quiet spaces where there isn't a light shone on them. And the opposite of shame isn't confidence, it's vulnerability. It's saying this was difficult. It's saying we got this wrong. It's role modeling that. And so I think it's saying something about this is what we believe about leadership. And it's really interesting what Ali said about ego. It's really easy to get caught up in an expectation of giving ourselves an expectation of something along the lines of perfection when we're in these roles where eyes are on us. And yet we all know that it's when we see the full human in front of us. And that isn't about sort of crying every day, far from it. But it's about saying, we're constantly walking a whole range of experiences, and if we can honestly share where some of those are coming from and why we're making some of these decisions and who we are as people navigating difficult organisational life in a world that's constantly changing, it's a powerful thing to offer to the people that we're leading.
A lot of people that are watching this will be in the HR community. So they see a lot of this stuff. They see the manager that's going, no, this is honestly a restructure. It's not about their performance at all. What can HR or those people that are bystanders or participants in these processes do to make sure that that honest reflection goes on and the lessons are learned? Because it's easy for us to post-rationalise things and move on quickly, but otherwise it just gets repeated again in history for the next issue as well.
The last few months, we have had a huge interest from the HR community. That the book has really landed in the HR community in the sort of wanting to know more and understanding that, how to, from that perspective. In the book, we talk about the architects and the implementers of endings. So, and somebody might be one and somebody might be the other. And somebody might be a bit of both. So an HRBP could be a bit of an architect, a bit of a designing with the leader and the manager, and also the implementer. Or you might have somebody who's just the implementer. And actually those two roles, because you're calling them sort of, bystanders, but they are absolutely in it. And our honest answer is that what we would like to do is to equip them. We would like I think our next ambition, having said we wanted to start a conversation, is we think possibly the most exciting way of translating this into organisations is to equip those architects and implementers through the uniqueness is the HR role. And that if we could help them understand their own relationship to endings, what might be going on for them, understand how to use the work, that we can upskill them, we can give them capacity in supporting those leaders and managers in how to do it. And I get all excited when I get into this. I think that is the single next biggest thing that we could do, is actually to really, really upskill those people. And I think there's appetite for it. That's what I think we're realizing, that there is appetite, because that is where we can have that. What's the word? Get the most leverage. That's not the word I'm looking for, but where you could, if we can help them to be better at this and not shy away from themselves, and therefore notice when they're seeing it in their leaders and managers, that they can maybe pull them back from being architects of the restructure that because they're avoiding something, or if they are going to implement it, actually helping them upskill to implement it.
Connected to your question, Gavin, we often get asked, what about when there's legal process? What about, the HR community is saying to us, what about when we literally can't talk about it? And to Ali's point, what excites us is that it's like any leadership skill, or any skill actually, the more you practice it when you don't need it, the more it will be available to you when you do. So if we can be equipping organisations to culturally be having more endings conversations where there is a difficult process, then, for example, you can be confident, as in HR, you might be able to be more confident that whilst there are things you can't talk about, you have equipped that person to do that for themselves, or you have equipped the organisation to be having these conversations and to be doing what they can. And quite often we talk about how this work happens on a piece of paper that nobody else will ever read. But the point is that by doing it, you've given yourself an opportunity. So there's something about embedding this practice culturally that means that people are equipped for when they need it, even when it's what we call in the book tricky and messy.
I was just going to go back and draw on a thread you started, Lizzie, a little bit earlier about the idea that not all endings are negative, and that there's growth. We're working with a lot of high growth companies at the moment, and that comes with its own need to acknowledge the change and the endings of phases. I'm just struck by some organisations, they grow quickly and then people are mourning, this isn't, it's not the same as it was when I joined and we were a 20-person scrappy startup, and now we're much bigger and there's structure, and I don't think organisations are very good at acknowledging that.
I think there's some starting with the end in mind that organisations can do, particularly startups, young organisations that have high ambition but don't necessarily make the connection. It's exactly what you've just described. Don't necessarily make the connection between us. If we achieve that ambition, what does this look like? What does it look like when there are 50 of us rather than 5 of us? What will it look like when there are 500 of us rather than 50 of us? And where do we, and this might change, of course, as time goes on, but to set an intention about where will we be marking these moments, not just in terms of numbers and figures, but in terms of really updating who we are within these organisations. Not least because then so often what that enables people to do is say, actually, I'm not the best person now to serve the ambition of this organisation. It means a lot to me that they achieve it. So how do I now navigate the fact that there's something for me, there's a role for me that's ending, that might even involve an exit from the organisation? And I'm sure you see this a lot, that it can be really complex for founders to be in boardrooms with board members who've been brought in to do specific things that the organisation needs now, that they want to see happen, but that then there can be all sorts of tricky stuckness in terms of who's responsible for what, and how those voices in that room are heard and responded to, because those threads haven't been carefully disentangled. And our ambition and our understanding of what the reality of that ambition will look and feel like when we achieve it, it often comes as a surprise to people. So when we talk about brighter beginnings, one of the things we'd love to do, or love for organisations, is for them to be so happy to see an ending happen because they know it's about the beginning, and they're willing, therefore, to look at the ending right from the get-go.
Hi, we're just pausing this interview for a moment. Have you ever finished an episode of the OrgDev podcast and wish you had a cheat sheet that summarises all of the key points? Us too, so we made one. It's called From Pod to Practice, and each week in our newsletter we'll share a 2-page summary of the latest OrgDev episode, and it includes key takeaways, a reflection prompt, and one small action you can try.
And it's all in a digital format with space at the end to add your own notes and reflections, and it's designed to help you take the learning from the podcast into your day-to-day work. So to get your copy, just sign up to our Next Step to Better newsletter. The link's in the show notes, or you can visit our website at www.distinction.live to get the latest From Pod to Practice in your inbox. And let us know what you think. We'd love to get your feedback. Yeah, so just shifting gears slightly, what do you enjoy most about the work that you do? What do you find most fulfilling or exciting?
I think for me, it's seeing it in action. So when we brought the work into the world, we brought it into the world for our practices. And we've always said we're practitioners. We didn't want to write a book that was full of theory. We wanted it to be light on frameworks and useful. And so it is when we actually do something with it with our clients, and it helps them get unstuck and move forward towards that brighter beginning, because it's incredibly validating. It's incredibly validating to hear that what we have written or how we use the work with our clients actually makes a difference, because that's the reason for being, that's the purpose.
And I had a number of encounters with people at Christmas parties where they talked about having read the book and the difference it's made to them to read it. Or they've said things like, I wish I'd had this 10 years ago. Or what we often hear is, I wish my boss had read that book. And whilst obviously we don't, the point of writing the book is for there to be less of those experiences, to hear that it resonates and to hear that those individual stories, and that people are able to shift those stories for themselves by working through those steps. It feels great.
On the flip side, what challenges do you encounter and how do you navigate them as well? Like when you're trying to embed this work into organisations?
So the flip side of that individually is that the other thing that we're quite often hearing at parties and in other places is, I bought your book, but I haven't read it yet. And there's a reluctance to read it that I think is a sort of mini version of actually what you've just asked about, Garen, which is an organisational reluctance, because there's an assumption that this is going to be difficult. And there's perhaps a lack of understanding of what the benefits are, what the brighter beginnings are. So we totally get it. At the same time as our response is, read it. Because if you do, you'll find that we're not just being theoretical. We're saying, here are the benefits, here's a way through, give it a go. And also saying, and if you need some support, reach out, ask for it. Don't try and don't try and go it alone. But there's an assumption that this is going to be difficult. And there are two things we'd say to that. One is it might not be as difficult as you think. And the other is difficult is okay. Probably means it's worth doing.
And I guess when you're doing it the first time, it's very rare that you'll do it perfectly. So is there a certain amount of clumsiness that comes with it? So just trying to initiate the process and maybe saying the wrong thing sometimes, but just trying to be more like just trying to practice it in the open.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily about doing all of it. It could be taking a bit of time to emotionally think about what might be going on, or thinking about what ritual you can do even though the circumstances are tricky. It can be light touch, it can be a little bit of it can be all of it. It's just about having a go. And if you've raised your awareness of endings and why we avoid them and why it might be useful to go towards them, that's progress. That's why we started the ambition of starting the conversation. And I think that's the most difficult thing, is because nobody talks about this and now people are talking about it. It's to get that momentum so that it does become something that is in built capacity in our leaders and in our HR and OD communities.
If you kind of reflect back on your career so far, this is quite a big question. What are some of the kind of key lessons that you take with you?
Ali's already touched on this, but that start with self. I think that experience of being on the courses and thinking, it's about me again, but paying consistent attention to that supervision, peer supervision, continually having the conversations about what's my response to this? What am I learning about myself? And how does that therefore impact my availability to the people that I'm here to facilitate and coach? I think that's been of huge value to me. But the other thing that has become of increasing value to me is to be starting with strengths, to be thinking strengths. It connects to our accomplishments pillar. But the more I pay attention to strengths when I don't need to, the more I find them available to me when I do need them. And I see that in clients, both at an individual and an organisational level too. I'm fascinated by the benefits of separating out and naming strengths.
I think one of the things that's really stuck out for me, which I always hold, is that curiosity is the opposite of judgment. I find as a practitioner, sitting in front of many different types of leaders and people and teams, as a human being, judgment often kicks in, and there's a difference between judgment and discernment. And when I find that judgment voice kicking in, which can be very strong at times because that's how we are built, I know that if I go towards curiosity, that I'm engaged and I'm understanding the other person. I suppose that's one of the lessons that I hold through all of that reflective practice and supervision and everything else that Lizzie's articulated, is actually keeping that constant curiosity so that sense of othering other people is kept at bay, and you're staying in relationship and you're staying in that space of being really, really useful to the people we're sitting in front of.
Ali, we've never described it like this, but listening to you talk there, I think that's what we're trying to offer with those steps. Here's a way to be curious about endings, because curiosity is, as Ali has said, that's the antidote to judgment.
I think that's a very worthy quote we can take forward from this. So thank you as well.
One question we like to ask people is what does your own learning and development look like? How are you kind of keeping on top of your own practice and evolving that? What does that look like for you currently?
So there's two things currently for me. The first one is more of a reflective practice about my client conversations. So that's sort of, continuously learning with them. I've been doing this for 21 years, and you can get to the position where you rock up and you do your thing. And so actually paying more attention to every conversation and reinstating a reflective practice of what I really heard and what my part in it was and how that has gone and how it could be different is something that I'm paying attention to at the moment. And the other bit for me is, I was saying I've gone back to Susan David and emotional agility today, just forever more and more fascinated by our emotional selves, where they sit in our bodies and how they show up. One of the things that Lizzie and I use are emotions cards. So when we are talking to people, we give them a whole load of cards with lots of different emotions written on to help them identify where they are. And the equivalent that I use and Lizzie does this as well, when we're on this sort of medium, is an emotions wheel. And again, it's a safe, easy way of, if somebody's not really understanding, because they're very good at understanding what's going on in here, but they're not so used to understanding what the emotional element, which is probably a driving element of what's going on in their behaviour, it takes the basic emotions and then gives you the different hues of it. So if somebody says I'm frustrated, we know that frustration is as Lizzie says, a lid on anger. But by using an emotions wheel, it really helps people explore emotions that they might easily relate to or find more difficult to get into. So I'm experimenting a lot with that at the moment.
I love one of the big things is that managers, a lot of people are accidental managers. They don't necessarily put themselves in that place. They were kind of found themselves in it. And so they're not as maybe emotionally aware or emotionally literate. And you said hue. So it's about having a bigger palette of colours to articulate how you're feeling or how your people are feeling as well, which means better conversations, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And that's something you can have as a team, to think, well, I didn't know that being remorseful was actually basically saying I'm sad, because I might be somebody that thinks it's not okay to be sad. So it's back to accessibility, ease, doesn't have to be scary. It's a really, really useful way of getting into into that.
We have a lot of readers, and obviously we do recommend your book 100%, and you'll find a link to your book in the show notes as well. And you said about the whole point about giants and the people whose work has influenced you. Can you recommend perhaps a book or a podcast or video that's inspired you, could potentially benefit our listeners if they want to sort of take a little bit of a deeper dive into this area?
So I'd really recommend a deeper dive into the work of David Rock. So we talk in the book about the SCARF model. I don't know whether that's a model that you've looked at before on here, David Rock's work on neuro leadership and relational leadership, and he's done all sorts of really interesting work. And one of the things we quickly connected to as we were doing this work is that endings touch all those 5 SCARF domains that David Rock has identified: status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, fairness. And actually I saw something recently, and it's led me to revisit his work again, that more recently when they've been revisiting their work, they're identifying how fairness is now one of the strongest drivers of behaviour and relationships. So I'm really intrigued about that. I have a strong fairness driver myself. I'm aware of it, I recognise it, and I try to use it as a useful driver, but also as one that I need to pay attention to, and where might I be overplaying it. So I'd really recommend, I mean, there are podcasts, books, articles, you name it. Have a dive into David Rock's work.
I think Brené Brown sits at the heart of so much of where modern leadership has been going and is going. Lizzie's already talked about her vulnerability and shame work, courageous leadership. I think it's a brilliant place to dive back into her work. The first of her books I read, Daring Greatly, I then got on tape, and not tape, it would have been CD. I probably ran the CD out that I knew it off by heart. But her Daring Greatly, quote is from the Theodore Roosevelt about talking about, it's a speech I think he did in something like 1918, talking about being in the arena. And if you're in the arena, you get knocked out, but you stand up, and the bloody man stands up and is marred again. I think we're saying, get yourself a little bit in the arena. Here's a handrail. It's not as scary as you think. It has huge impact, but dare a little bit greatly around this. So yeah, I'd come time and time again to Brené Brown.
I chuck one more thing in the mix.
So we love references, so yes, go for it.
Well, so I'm going to have to take my glasses off and look to my bookshelves, but it kind of relates to your question, Danny, about evolving as well. And I would say that the last 10 years of my practice and my learning have been characterized by trying to understand what I don't know, and realizing just how much I haven't paid attention to, and using that as the starting point for going to find out more about, particularly around inclusive practice in coaching and in organisational development. And I think it's that what are we not paying attention to question that really drives Ali and I in our work as well. We knew this was something people weren't paying attention to. We knew that it was something we weren't paying attention to. That was the first conversation we had about this. We realised, oh, hold on a second. When it comes to coaching, we pay so much attention to what we call that contracting stage. How do we pay equally intentional, thoughtful attention to how we close, and what would the impact of that be? And myriad of conversations since then. So keep thinking about what you might not know or you might be missing is a great way to work out where to head next for resource, I think.
So this has been a brilliantly expansive conversation. We've shone the torch in lots of different parts of organisation and personal life as well. If we could leave the audience with one takeaway from take out of this conversation, what would it be for you?
For me, it's something we've repeatedly said throughout, and it's worth saying again, is be ready to start with yourself. It will be okay. Start with yourself.
I think we could have called the book Goodbye and Hello, because it is goodbye in service of brighter beginnings. And we hope that energy, and we deliberately made the front cover a lovely, bright, energizing colour, that energy will help people think that looking at endings and goodbye will be in service of them going forward.
To beginnings. It's all about the brighter beginnings.
Well, what an amazing end. It's been such a brilliant conversation. It's been incredibly thought-provoking. I don't know about you, Danny, but there's loads of takeaways from me. What are you taking away from the conversation?
I think it's hard to do it justice, just wrapping up in a few points. I think we've covered lots of ground, and I think you've done a lovely job of kind of making the case for paying attention to endings. So thank you for that. I think I've really enjoyed the idea that endings and beginnings are just intertwined. You can't treat them separately. I love what you said about invisible threads of endings and kind of, working that through. And I think something you said towards the beginning around the invitation to be stewards of endings for the whole system has really stuck with me. So thank you.
Yeah, and for me, do you know, I think it's one of those books and interviews where I'm going to keep waking up at 3 a.m. and rewrite my own past. One of the stories that came to my mind is I remember when I got a first promotion to manager many, many years ago, and I remember feeling a sense of mourning about it, and now it all makes sense. And I remember saying to my colleagues at the time, because I'm becoming manager of this team, it's not going to change anything, is it? And all of a sudden, no one started to go to lunch with me because I was the manager. And all of a sudden, you start to realize in your past that often what is a good thing is often there's an ending in there as well. And that I think that talks to one of the other things you talked about is the importance of time and space and letting things be. And it's not about the manager fixing it as well. I love the term that you talked about is marshmallowing. I think that's a really lovely turn of phrase as well. And the ultimate quote that you said, which is like curiosity is the antidote to judgment as well. So I think our audience are going to get so much value from it. And I know that they're going to want to connect with you as well and follow your work. So if people do want to connect with you or follow your work or read the book, where would you advise them to go? And I guess one thing you also do as well, on your website, you've got a deeper dive into 4 specific areas on your website. So how can people find you?
So you can find either of us on LinkedIn, Alison Lucas and Lizzie Bentley Bowers. There is a website that houses the book, the podcast. Thank you very much, Garen, for referencing those, which is goodbyecoach.co.uk.
There's some resources on there too, that if you need some things that help you facilitate an inquiry for yourself or others, you'll find some resources on there to help you too.
Brilliant. And the book is available on Amazon and all the regular. And there he goes. Danny's, for those that listen on audio, is waving the book in front of you as well. It's well, when I say a huge thank you, if you are watching this and you think you know someone that's either experiencing an end, is facilitating an end, or has been affected by an end in the past, please do share this. Danny and I are always so impressed with the number of shares that we get as well. So if you do know someone, please share a link with them and let them listen to it as well. And also, if you do like it, then please hit the like button because the algorithm gods love it, and subscribe to the channel because it enables us to get brilliant guests like Alison and Lizzie to share their work with us as well. But most importantly, we want to say a huge thank you to Alison and Lizzie. It's been brilliant. We want to say thank you for writing a book and articulating something that Danny and I have been trying to articulate for years. And now we've got something to point someone towards. It's got science and everything. so we're really appreciative, but a huge thank you to you both. We know you're really busy, so thanks for making time.
Thank you for hosting us so beautifully.
Yeah, I loved your questions. Thank you. It's been great.